Hello, my random viewers, and welcome to Randomly Offensive. Today, we are going to be talking about King from the Tekken franchise and covering his story, because he is an incredibly iconic character, not just in the Tekken franchise, but in arcade fighting games as a whole. He is one of the most iconic characters to be on the screen. And people love King. He is incredibly iconic. He has a huge fan base. And the reason for that is because people love tragic heroes. And that's exactly what King is a tragic hero. He has an incredibly tragic backstory, and he has a very sad, tragic story through Tekken 1 and 2, because the King I am covering today only debuts in the first two Tekkens, because the King for the rest of the games is not the same King that we saw in the first game. However, the King that I am covering today is the one that created the iconic vision of King because of his tragedy and because of the kind of man that he is. He makes you the kind of man that you want to be, and he makes you the kind of person that you want to strive to become. And everything he goes through makes you makes your heart break because of the fact that you don't ever want to have to experience what this man experiences, and you never want to go through that. He's no longer just a cool character in the Tekken franchise. He goes away from the Heihachi, Kazuha, Jin storylines of just cool, epic stories of unbelievable power, and he also goes away from the fun stories of Paul, martial law, and forest law, where they're mostly just goofing around and they're living everyday life. King is a tragic hero, and because of that, he is just an incredible person to delve into and an incredible person to talk about. So with that all being said, let's dive into it. Our story begins with a young boy who has no parents, no family, and has been alone for as long as he can remember. And the only joy that he finds is every Sunday getting to turn on the TV at the orphanage that he lives at and watch the Armored King, a great famous luchador, wrestling and fighting and dominating. And this young boy admires just the fact and the pure strength and persistence that this Armored King shows, and this little boy becomes a huge fan of Armored King. Now, this boy ends up growing up and starts delving into the art of professional wrestling and aspires to become a luchador. Now, he ends up being taken in by a very friendly family, and he ends up being taken care of by this family and finally gets to know love and finally gets to know what it feels like to have a family. And then finally, when he decides to achieve his dream and pursue his dream of being a famous luchador and being a pro wrestler, he ends up being disowned by his family, because it is not a dream nor a career that is honorable, and it is not a career that he should be following. And so, by following his dream that he's had ever since a kid and trying to live up to an icon that got him through the tough times, is the very thing that caused him to lose what he's always wanted, which was a family. And so he ends up taking the name of King, and he ends up donning the jaguar mask, and he is a very loving man, and he founds an orphanage, and he's running an orphanage and taking care of all these kids. However, he's just not making enough money, being the wrestler that he is, to take care of this orphanage and the amount of kids that he's taking. And so that is when he decides to go ahead and join the Iron Fist tournament. Now, the Armored King that we mentioned is not canon in the first game, and he's not in the first game. Also, the Armored King that King looked up to as a kid is not going to be the same Armored King throughout the franchise. And when he becomes a luchador, Armored King is passed down to another person. The title of Armored King is passed down, and they end up becoming rivals throughout his history. And he has fought this Armored King multiple times, and these two have created a rivalry, but also a friendship. However, Armored King does not compete in the first Iron Fist tournament. So King is going in there, and he's needing to make money. He's hoping to settle for the cash prize, winning the tournament, in order to take care of all these orphans that he has taken in and has promised to protect and feed and shelter. So upon being accepted into the Iron Fist tournament, King says goodbye to his orphanage and his orphans and tells them that he will be back, and he will be back with what he needs to feed them and shelter them. And so with that, King takes off and heads to the first Iron Fist tournament. So the first Iron Fist tournament is held in a forest area, and King's first opponent is Jack. Now, Jack is the strongest character all the way up until Tekken 3, because he's mostly robotic. He's an android type character, and Jack starts the fight off by tearing a tree out of the ground and swinging it down as if it was a sword or a samurai directly towards King. And that is when King is able to show his immense strength, because he catches the damn tree that was swung with immense might directly towards him, and he catches the tree above his head and is holding this tree up as Jack is pressing it down, trying to crush King. And so King does start getting tired, his muscles start wearing, until he steps to the right and throws the tree to the right, and the tree slams into the ground, causing a huge cloud of dirt to arise into the air, and King launches through the dirt cloud and engages into hand-to-hand combat with Jack. Now, every punch that King throws causes a dent in the metal parts of Jack's torso, and same with Jack's face. Not only that, but the speed of King's strikes are far faster than anything that Jack is capable of throwing, due to Jack's just pure mass and body style, right? And so King is just sending this onslaught of attacks at a high speed and a high strength volume, because King cannot get punched by Jack, at least as far as he's concerned. He does not want to get hit by this guy, because he just tore a tree out of the fucking ground. You don't want to be hit by a man that is capable of that kind of feat. So King is dancing around this guy and going from strikes to grapples to strikes to grapples. He will grapple Jack's left arm and just crank it right behind Jack and put him in an arm lock, while delivering open palm strikes and elbows to the back of Jack's head. And when Jack manages to get free of said grapple, then King just continues with offensive strikes and maneuvers. And as King overwhelms Jack, Jack is deciding that he needs to win this fight, right? So he gets in this sitting type form and starts kicking his legs out while in the sitting stance, and is just delivering massive kicks to King's left leg, just repeatedly, one after another, and trying to knock King down. But King is not falling down. He's just receiving these kicks to the knee, and that will cause damage in the future of his fights going on. However, for now, it seems like he's doing just fine. And now Jack finally stands up and delivers a massive punch that connects in between King's rib cages, just throwing King backwards and knocking the air out of King. But King doesn't care. He gets back up, even though he just lost his breath and had the breath knocked out of him, and just flies right back to Jack, and he continues the onslaught that he was once delivering, combining grapples with strikes and just dancing in circles around this massive robotic force to be reckoned with, Jack. But when Jack starts throwing attacks, King has no choice but just to put his arms up and defend himself and protect himself for his life, because every punch that connects to the forearm or the bicep of King as he blocks these massive attacks sends shockwaves through the valley, through the forest. It's shaking trees, it's causing the grass to move. And so whenever Jack starts throwing these onslaughts of punches, King is just held defenseless as he holds his arms up, protecting his face and his torso. Now, the worst part about this fight is anytime King tries to do a stranglehold, it doesn't affect Jack, because Jack doesn't need oxygen. That also means that Jack is never going to get tired. So King starts having the odds stack against him very quickly throughout this fight, and he's getting to a point where he is not going to be able to continue doing this forever, where Jack can do this for hundreds of years. I mean, because he just has nothing to lose. He doesn't have any energy to lose. He doesn't have any oxygen to lose. And honestly, Jack was set up to be one of the most powerful fighters in the Tekken franchise. It was only because of his lack of fandom that never happened. So, King, in this fight, decides to pick up this 1,000-pound boulder. And he picks this fucking thing up. And of course, his legs are shaking, his arms are trembling, and he has this thing up, and Jack is going to punch him right in the stomach and cause this boulder to fall on top of him. And that is when King throws this boulder, and just at a massive speed, and it's causing the grass on the ground to actually be moved due to the pure pressure and speed and force that this boulder was thrown at. And it hits Jack and sends Jack flying right into the side of a mountain. And when the boulder finally lets loose, that's when you see Jack's, basically his software giving out, and he finally shuts down. And so King manages to take the win. However, he's damaged. It's almost the exact same story as Heihachi. He has hardly any energy left. He just used up a lot of his strength, and his left kneecap is just not looking good. And with his second match on the way, he is looking at martial law, a master martial artist, and with the amount of pain and lack of energy that King just put forth, he's gonna need a break. And luckily, it's given to him. Whether you agree with this next move or not, the break that King needed has been given to him, because martial law has been watching King on the telly because of him being a famous luchador. So martial law puts his hands together and bows in respect, and King decides to take this as his chance to end this fight as fast as he can, and he runs directly towards martial law, jumps in the air, extends both his legs out, and both his legs just connect to martial law's face, sending martial law flipping and flying and sliding across the ground, knocking martial law out within one move. And with that, King gets the second round as his victory. Now, whether you agree with that move or not, I think it's a really low blow, but you can understand why he did it, because his own victory and his own profits are not what's at stake here. It's the lives of the kids that he is trying to take care of who do not have a family, and he just used up everything he had in the first fight. And so with that being said, the third round is on the way. The third round is the final round before the championship round, and he goes up against Kazuha. Now, we all know what Kazuha is capable of. This guy is a beast, and King gives it his all. He is throwing massive attacks, very skillful landed blows, and he's, again, combining his strikes with his grapples. However, Kazuha is escaping from those grapples much faster, much easier than Jack was able to, due to him being more nimble than Jack ever was. And so, not only that, but Kazuha is much more trained and much more efficient when it comes to the martial arts style and fighting styles. This guy has been fighting in tournaments since before Tekken 1, and he went up against Paul in the past. And this guy has gone up against incredible fighters. And so he's going up against King very, very well. However, King is not a chump, right? He is giving Kazuha the run for his money. Unfortunately, he's having to nurse his left leg due to the constant punishment that it went through when going up against Jack. And also his muscles, again, are strained due to catching that fucking tree and having to pick up that boulder. And so his punches aren't landing with the fierce amount of strength that they would have if he came into this fight fresh. And so Kazuha is just standing his ground and managing to fend off King. However, every time King does manage to get the advantage, it's almost as if Kazuha is pulling energy from nowhere. He's pulling out of his ass and getting stronger and landing blows even more ferociously than in the beginning of the fight. And the reason for that is because, unlike the rest of the fighters, when Kazuha ends up going through strain from the first few battles, Kazuha can tap into that devil gene. He has that devil gene and that devil form to rely on, and the purple aura starts showing. And so it is because of King that Heihachi sees the devil genes starting to show in Kazuha, because King is pushing Kazuha to his very limits. Eventually, Kazuha does overcome King, and I'm gonna have to save the majority of this battle for Kazuha's story, because King is just an amazing opponent against Kazuha. And so with that being said, Kazuha ends up taking the fight, and King ends up losing, taking third place in the tournament, meaning he does not get the cash money he needs to take care of all these kids that don't have families, that need to eat, that need a place to live. King ends up going home with this failure, and when he returns to the orphanage, he finds out that in his absence, an orphan passed away due to sickness, because there was nobody there to care for him except for his fellow orphans. And that is when King just breaks down. He goes into a depression. He hands away the orphanage to more capable hands, and he goes and starts living a life where he is dedicated to alcohol and bars, and he goes missing for a very long time. King spends the duration between Tekken 1 and Tekken 2 drowning his sorrows with the bottle and just trying to handle the fact that he failed so many children and that he failed the only life goal that he's ever had. And so now he has been missing for quite some time, and Armored King is getting worried about his once greatest rival, because he hasn't been in wrestling matches ever since his loss at the first tournament. He's been missing. And so he finally finds King stumbling through an alley, and he throws down the Jaguar mask and tells him that there's a second Iron Fist tournament and that he can regain everything that he once lost. And so King does decide that it is time to do it again, and Armored King helps him through these hard times, getting him trained back up, because he hasn't trained this whole time. He's become just a raging alcoholic. And so now King has a very short amount of time to train, and he gets as trained as he can, and he gets his body somewhat back, but his body's nowhere near as fit or as in shape as it was in the first tournament. And so he then enters the second tournament. He's accepted into the second tournament, and he enters the second tournament far weaker than he was in the original game. So again, Tekken 2 is held in an island, mostly forest area with a volcano in the middle. Now, King's first opponent is Lee, Heihachi's second son. Now, Lee is a pretty toned man, and he's pretty skilled in a certain martial art. However, most of Lee's story and most of Lee's character arc development is outside of the tournament, because, as we're about to see, he's just not on the same level at all as the rest of these guys. His skill and his passion is not in fighting. He's mostly doing it to win the approval of his father. King has much more at stake than getting approval from Daddy. King is needing to get his orphanage back. He is wanting to make sure he can take care of more kids, and he's having to redeem himself of his past failures. Sorry if you heard my phone going off there. So he's needing to redeem himself for his past failures. And so with the first match starting, Lee just charges right into battle and throws probably the fastest kicks that you'll ever see thrown, and they all connect with King because he doesn't have time to react. However, he realizes that those kicks didn't even do anything. I mean, they hurt a little bit, but not much. And then Lee starts throwing these elbows and these punches. Again, they're all connecting, but they're not doing anything. And that's when King realizes that someone has been accepted who shouldn't have been accepted. And that's when King realizes that this guy is not on the same level as the rest of the Tekken roster. And so he just backhands Lee, and Lee goes flying across the land, and he's out for the count. It was a very easy win for King, and King's thinking to himself, like, you know, if this is the level of the new contenders, then I'm gonna be just fine. I'm not worried about this at all. And so he goes on to the second match with renewed vigor and high hopes. In the second match, he goes up against Paul Phoenix. Now, Paul Phoenix is an incredible fighter, and he's nobody to be reckoned with. Now, when this match begins, I did cover it in Paul's storyline. However, I want to cover it again from the perspective of King. So, Paul is landing these massive blows that can shake the very foundation of the land that these two are standing on. And it is causing not quite as much as Jack did, but it is causing sonic booms to be released from the fists every time they connect. And King is being forced to defend himself very, very intensely in order not to get knocked out by these hits. And King does revert back to his combination of striking and attacking while grappling. However, they're not as effective as they once were because he's no longer as strong as he once was. And he's an incredible, weaker version of what he once was. And so he's having to dance around Paul and try to land these blows against Paul, and these blows are shaking Paul, and Paul's blows are shaking King, and they end up getting involved in this hit-for-hit type game, where every time Paul hits King, it does far more damage to King than it ever did to Paul, but King just returns that punch right afterwards, and using as much energy and force that he can to shake Paul as well, giving the illusion that he's equal, and Paul buys into this illusion. And after a while, King finally ends up managing to get a grapple on this guy, and he starts going from one grapple to another, to another, to another, to another, slamming Paul repeatedly into the ground in various different types of forms. And this is a very iconic moveset for King, going from one grapple to another, and it's very exciting when you pull it off. But anyway, so as King is just going from one grapple to another, just slamming Paul to the ground, he finally incapacitates Paul and knocks Paul out, and he gets to go to the third round. However, this is a completely different scenario for King because he had to use so much energy on Paul, but he didn't get weakened by Paul. He is not in the same state he was in the first tournament where he gave everything he had in the first two fights. He's actually okay now. He's in a good standing position, and he goes up against the former king of the Iron Fist, Heihachi Mishima. Shit. You know this isn't gonna go well for King, and King knows it too. However, so King gets in this defensive stance. He's ready for this Titan to rock him down. And Heihachi does not move, for reasons I'm not going to get into in this video. And if you haven't seen my Heihachi storyline, definitely go check it out. However, King is just standing off and seeing this guy open his body up. And he tells King, like, come on, bring it on. Fucking give me the best you got. Give me everything you have. And King takes this, just like he took the opportunity with Law. He's like, an easy win. I'm going to take any easy win I can get. So he runs up and delivers a massive chamber kick to Heihachi's chest. And it doesn't even make Heihachi budge. Heihachi doesn't even move. And this intimidates King. And Heihachi uses his hands to signal more. And so King decides to give him more. He's going to take this opportunity for an easy win because it's not his pride. It's not his ego. And that's not what's at stake right now, right? And so he decides to just deliver this massive onslaught of punches and these blows are massive, and he's throwing everything he has on Heihachi, and 5 minutes pass and he's still throwing blows, and he feels his body giving out, and he's been doing nothing but for the last 5 minutes throwing punch after punch after punch, putting everything he has into these punches, and this man isn't moving. Like, how strong can anybody become? How is this even possible that a man is just taking his punches as if they are nothing? And he's continuing these massive blows, and another 5 minutes pass, and his punches aren't having any effect. He can feel his body not delivering punches, and he's taking everything he has to deliver a punch now. And so now he decides to put Heihachi into a grapple, a neck hold, and he's squeezing as hard as he can in this chokehold, trying to choke out the former king of the Iron Fist. And this goes on for 4 minutes of King just putting everything he has, and finally he can't do it anymore, and his arms start to weaken, and King just pulls his head out and stands up. And this is when King looks at Heihachi, thinking one punch is all it takes. The fight hasn't even begun, and when it does, King wouldn't stand a chance. And knowing that his former self would have been able to at least stand a chance against Heihachi, realizing that who he is now, the body he has now, just doesn't stand a chance against the former champion of the Iron Fist. And it's because of his drinking, it's because of his depression, it's because of him handling his emotions the wrong way that he cannot achieve his dream. He is the reason why he cannot accomplish his dream. He is the reason why he will not be able to take care of any kids or orphans, and he falls to his knees in defeat. And this is when everyone takes it as King's loss, and King walks away as a failure from the second tournament. However, King is revigored. He realizes that the Iron Fist tournament is just at a whole new level of fighters, but he can still be the champion luchador in professional wrestling. And so he goes back into wrestling, and he manages to make enough money by going on to talk shows and just putting himself forth and trying to accumulate enough money to take back his orphanage. And throughout the years, he drops off gifts for all the orphans, and the orphans get to see him. Though he has never been able to buy back an orphanage, he comes and visits that orphanage constantly. And there's the eldest orphan ends up being trained by King, and King trains him in the style and fighting style of being a luchador in professional wrestling, and is helping this oldest orphan achieve his dream, because he has the same dream that King had. And so now, every year and every month, he brings Christmas gifts, and he brings Thanksgiving dinners, and he does what he can with the money that he makes, and he is training this oldest orphan. Well, one day, this is about 15 years later after the Tekken 2 events, one day, this green creature, this green man, is walking towards the orphanage and has his sights on the oldest orphan while King is dropping off food. And King sees it, and this guy is giving off a very intimidating, very dangerous aura. And so he sends all the kids into the orphanage, including the oldest orphan. And the oldest orphan is watching through the window as King is telling this green man, this threat, to leave. He just keeps walking towards King, and this green man won't stop, and this green man is no other than the Ogre. And so as King gets closer to Ogre and telling him to leave, the Ogre won't stop. And so that is when King decides to tell him that he is intruding on private property, and if he does not leave, King will be forced to use force, right? And will have to remove him by force. And the Ogre just starts engaging in battle with King, and he starts punching King and kicking King and sending knees to the gut of King and delivering elbows to the face of King. And King tries to fight back, King tries to defend, but he cannot. He is overwhelmed by this power. And as King gets beat to a bloody pulp, the oldest orphan and the rest of the orphans are watching their hero get beat to the ground. And King refuses to stay down. Every time King is beaten down, Ogre begins to walk towards the orphanage, and King stands back up and gets back in the way and receives even more punishment and gets beaten to a bloody pulp over and over and over and over and over again. Even though he stands no chance of winning, he refuses to allow the ogre to get into this orphanage. And that's when he uses his hand and knocks down a very, very large shed that is right in front of the orphanage. And he manages to tear it down off of its foundations and blocking the door into the orphanage. And as he did that, he used his final amount of strength, and that is when Ogre grabs King by the throat. And with all the orphans watching through the window, Ogre snaps the neck of King, dropping a lifeless, dead body in front of the orphanage. And the ogre then walks off as if nothing happened. Now, the oldest orphan sees this and manages to get out of the orphanage through the window and go over the rubble of the torn down shed and gets to King. And sure enough, King is dead. And he has been murdered by an unknown man. And the oldest orphan is filled with pain, for this is the only father figure that he has ever had, and is the only man that actually would come and visit all these kids, and was the only reason they would receive gifts every Christmas and receive these fantastic meals every Thanksgiving. And he now lays there in a lifeless corpse. Now, starting our story off is with King the Second, because King the First was tragically murdered by Ogre, with this king being one of the orphans that got to watch that tragedy take place before his very eyes. And he now has decided to don the jaguar mask and has taken the name of King the Second. However, for the duration of this video, we will only refer to him as King. Now, he doesn't just want to take over the title of king, but he also wants to keep everything that King stood for, which was pride, honor, and above all, taking care of those who are incapable of taking care of themselves. And so this new king decides to start working at the orphanage that he resides at and climbing the ranks to eventually become the head of the orphanage and be the same father figure that King the First was, because King the First not only was the founder of this orphanage, but was one of the only men that would consistently come and visit these orphans, was the only person to come and bring them gifts every Christmas and every Thanksgiving. And this young man just had to watch that figure be brutally murdered. Now, with that being said, Armored King, King's arch rival or former arch rival, has of course heard about this on the news and has decided to come and adopt King. And with that adoption, he is adopting King to train him in the ways of his predecessor. And so with the adoption underway, King now has someone to call father. However, Armored King will never take that title. He is master. And King quickly learns that Armored King training style is nowhere near the kindness and patience of King the First. King is now having to realize that he is being thrown in survival situations in the middle of nowhere for weeks on end, having to survive on nothing but his own wit and what the land has to provide. Armor King also does not hold back his punches during their sparring sessions, beating the crap out of this young man. And this goes on for 4 years. Now, you'd think that King would grow a hatred for Armored King, but that's not the case. Armored King grows a bond with King, and they become very close. And now, even though he lost his first father figure, King now has a father figure and has someone to call dad. though it is always in the form of calling him master, that is close enough for King II. So, the day finally comes to where the third King of the Iron Fist tournament is announced, and King decides to draw and try to get in hopes that the Ogre, who he calls the god of fighting, will also be a competitor. And so he signs, and he waits and waits and waits for days for the acceptance letter. Armored King finally sees a letter for King II and hands it to him. King holds his breath as he opens it, hoping that this will be his chance to redeem his mentor. And as he opens it, he is denied acceptance for the King of the Iron Fist Tournament 3. So, with Tekken 3 on its way, the King of the Iron Fist Tournament starts, and King decides to go there anyway, just not as a competitor. And so he goes to the King of the Iron Fist Tournament and watches in awe at the incredible strength and might that all these fighters have brought to the table. However, he has been training his whole life under the original King I, and now he's been going through brutal training under Armored King for the past 4 years, so he's confident that he could have taken out all of these people. The guy's ripped, he is as fit as you can be, incredibly well trained, and he's honestly at a whole new level than King I, when King I was in his prime. He scouts the roster and looks at all the fighters in hopes that he will see the Ogre. However, the Ogre is nowhere to be seen. Will he never get a chance to avenge the death of King I? And if he does, how long must he wait? And how long must he train? So, as he's watching all of these fighters, round after round after round, the tournament slowly coming to an end, and Jin Kazuma ends up becoming the victor and gets to move on to the championship round, which is held in a tournament just east of the original fighting ring. And King sits in the empty area of where all the fighters once were and where the audience once was, and he looks up at the temple and sees a green figure walking towards the doorway, and so quickly he hops up and runs as fast as he can to the temple. As he approaches the green figure, it's coming more and more clear, and he's able to identify that this is King I murderer. This is Ogre, and he finally approaches Ogre, and he looks at him and gets in between him and the doorway, just like King I did all those years ago between the Ogre and the orphanage. The Ogre looks at him and recognizes his presence, knowing that Ogre, all those years ago, was going after this orphan, this man with such a powerful soul and such a strong will to survive. And Ogre gets a smile on his face, for he has a chance once again to consume that soul. "This day will be your last day," says King, as he knows he's about to avenge the death of King I. He is about to take revenge upon the murderer of his father figure, and with that, the fight between Ogre and King begins, and this is one of the most intense fights that King will ever experience, and this fight becomes super extreme, super fast. And immediately, King just tackles Ogre to the ground and starts delivering the Melon Smasher, where he just clasps both hands together and starts pounding down on Ogre like an insane ape. And King just goes ape shit on Ogre, just bashing this guy's face in and just smashing his fists into the face of Ogre, into the chest of Ogre, into anything that King can hit. That is exactly what he hits. He's not even aiming at this point. He's just gone in complete insane and blinded by vengeance. And Ogre is delivering punches the best he can to get King off of him, but it's not working. So Ogre reaches down to the ground with each hand on each side of him and digs his fingers into the cement, pulling cement gravel out of the ground, and then just bringing his hands together and smashing the cement on each side of King's face and just clapping the cement with King's face in between, creating a King cement sandwich. And then he manages to thrust King off of him. And as Ogre gets up, he realizes that he is bleeding, and this brings a smile to Ogre's face once again. What an honor. What an amazing opponent to get to consume. And so the Ogre charges in, throwing epic, massive kicks that are causing shockwaves throughout the temple and causing punches that are throwing punches that are causing equal amount of shockwaves, but the King is managing to block them with open palm blocks and rope-a-doping his way around every attack, delivering massive, equally massive blows to Ogre, and the Ogre is getting rocked and shaked by this exchange. Now King, he's getting injured, but he's not feeling anything. He is in a rage. He is blinded by his rage, and he manages to just force his hands through solid cement and pull up this massive block of cement, and he smashes it over the head of the Ogre, and then delivering a low roundhouse kick directly to the temple of Ogre. And Ogre gets rocked to the right a little bit and then just comes back with a left hook at the exact same time that King delivers a thrusting elbow, and the thrusting elbow connects right in the middle of Ogre's face, snapping his nose, with the left hook of Ogre connecting to the right rib cage of King, snapping every single rib on his right side. Again, he does not feel a thing. He's in rage. And so King just grabs the back of Ogre's skull and just starts smashing Ogre's face against his knee repeatedly over and over and over. And as Ogre loses strength in his legs, King picks that son of a bitch up by the back of his head and starts delivering elbows over and over and over and over into Ogre's face, and then just starts punching, uppercutting into the rib cages and stomach of Ogre. King is giving this guy a massive onslaught, and if you have ever played as King in the Tekken franchise, you know that King is a defensive player, not an offensive player. You have to master the defensive style gameplay when playing as King, but you'll also know that if you manage to get a flow in offensive attack, there is no stopping this son of a bitch, and that doesn't change just because we're no longer in the gameplay. That is his character, and it follows through in the mangas, in the animes, in the cutscenes. It follows through in everything, and so Ogre is not going to be able to stop this massive onslaught that King is putting out. King then performs the grapple chain that he is incredibly famous for, and it first debuted in Tekken 3. And as he's doing the grapple chain, he is slowly snapping the bones of Ogre, and Ogre for the first time wisping in pain. The first bone to snap is the left forearm of Ogre. The second three bones to snap are the ribs, and then a hip bone manages to get dislocated, his shoulder getting fractured, and his legs slowly starting to snap as King delivers the grapple chain that he's known for. And Ogre is repeatedly getting slammed into the ground, and picked back up and just going from one grapple to another. And the punishment that Ogre is receiving is unlike any punishment he has ever received before. King finally picks up Ogre above his head and slams him down on the ground as his final attack. And King is now tired. He's fighting for breath. He just put so much energy into this onslaught of attacks. But then he's horrified because the Ogre stands up and is ready for more. And even though he has broken bones all over his body, even though he just took massive amounts of punishment, he doesn't seem fazed. The Ogre then very quickly just grabs the throat of King and picks King up off the ground, and King is kicking and being choked incredibly fast, and the pressure on King's throat is incredible for one hand, especially of a hand that is on a guy who has broken bones everywhere. And King is quickly losing oxygen. He starts throwing punches towards the face of Ogre, but now Ogre is just ignoring them. They're not doing a thing. And with that, King slowly feels his body getting lighter. He feels his soul getting consumed. And with that, King is then no more. He is consumed by Ogre. King wakes up in nothing but darkness and silence. It's almost as if he's not standing on anything. There's no ground, there's no ceiling, there's no sky, there's nothing. Just pure darkness. And all he can feel are the reflections of his own emotions, his anger, his vengeance, and it's something that starts to terrify him. For how can something that awful and that intimidating be inside of his soul? King wanders the emptiness of this darkness that he is now in search of a way out, and after some time, he sees Jin Kazama, and he looks at Jin, and Jin looks at him. This is the Ogre. King nods. Yes, this is the Ogre. They are inside of the Ogre. Their souls have been consumed. If anybody can beat him, it's my grandfather Heihachi. I don't think you understand. There's nobody that can beat this man. And with that, Jin and King trade looks and then begin to search for a way out of the eternal darkness that they have found themselves in. Now, while they're searching for a way out, I want to make a couple clarifications now that I am capable of doing so without spoiling anyone's main story arc. So, King was equal in strength when it came to Ogre, at least somewhat. Ogre is an otherworld entity. He is a godlike being, so of course King would have never been able to beat him down. However, the Ogre that went up against Heihachi in my previous videos was the Ogre after consuming King, meaning the Ogre consumed all of King's strength, all of King's will, anger, hatred, vengeance, all of that. So, the Ogre going up against Heihachi was much, much stronger than the Ogre going up against King, because Ogre consumed King before the match with Heihachi. Now, with that also being said, whenever Ogre consumes souls, that heals his body. So all the damage he received from King was absent in the match against Heihachi. So, just in case you guys were thinking that I was trying to make King out to be stronger than Heihachi, do not worry, I am keeping everything in line with the continuity of the story. With that being said, let's go back to Jin and King. During their wanders, they find Kuma. Yes, the grizzly bear who was once a proud training partner of Heihachi has been consumed by the ogre. The three continue to wander, and they find Makujin, a tree who, spending his life in the forest, has managed to absorb enough intellect to become somewhat human. And as he fights, he absorbs those fighting styles and all their experiences and knowledge. And so the four of these guys continue to wander. And as they wander, they finally see a throne with this ugly, disgusting looking beast sitting upon it. This is what's known as true ogre, with massive horns on its head, an ugly spider-like face, a scorpion tail, and gigantic wings, and a moth-like body. Now, this is the soul of true ogre. While Heihachi is fighting the live true ogre in the real world, these four decide to commence battle against the soul of true ogre. As these five souls engage in battle, Heihachi is engaging in battle in the real world, and true ogre is having to divide his focus on half on Heihachi and the rest in the soul world, in the soul realm, going up against these five fighters. And this fight commences in one of the coolest frickin' team-ups that Tekken has to offer. And so the time has finally come, the time that King has been waiting for, the vengeance he's been training for, has finally come to put an end to King the First's killer. And these four just team up, and they're amazing together. You have King, who is able to carry the team by holding True Ogre in grapples, creating openings on True Ogre for attacks. You have Jin Kazuma, who's able to use the Devil Genes and the Holy Sense to charge up these massive blows, while True Ogre is in a grapple by King, and there's no way for True Ogre to block or dodge these massive strikes. And then, whenever True Ogre manages to get out of a grapple from King, Makujin comes into play, because Makujin has a worldwide list of just all these different types of martial arts, and he's even absorbed King style, Akuma style, and Jin Kazuma style. And so he's able to throw attacks that True Ogre cannot predict or block, and get True Ogre back into a defensive stance, where King can then grapple him again, and Jin Kazuma is then able to deliver massive blows. Kuma, being the massive powerhouse of a bear that he is able to deflect True Ogre's more devastating attacks, like his flames, right? Whenever True Ogre blows out flames, Akuma is able to just pull on those horns or force the body away, because Makujin's a tree. He cannot get hit by flames, right? Whenever True Ogre tries to use his scorpion tail on King, Kuma is able to grab that tail and force it down so that King doesn't get stabbed in the back while grappling. And the just team abilities, these guys work as a great team, and neither one of them are expendable. They are all needed. Each one needs the other. And so True Ogre realizes that he's about to lose, and it is better to become weaker than try to take on all these fighters. So he swipes away Makujin's soul, and Makujin is no longer absorbed. And then he takes on the remaining three. However, they're still working very, very well together, because now they don't need Makujin as much as they did, because True Ogre is weaker, and Heihachi is actually standing out and being able to take on True Ogre better because he is weaker in the real world as well. And Heihachi in the real world manages to get on top of True Ogre and just starts prying away at the horns of True Ogre, trying to tear them out of his skull. And so True Ogre is having to put more energy and more focus on Heihachi, so he swipes away Akuma, getting rid of a huge amount of strength that he once had. Now King and Jin, it's just these two men and Heihachi in the real world, and they are just going at each other, and they go at True Ogre with massive force. King is no longer just creating openings, he's throwing spear lunges, spear kicks, chamber kicks, thrusting elbows, you name it. He is throwing every attack he can, while Jin too is throwing out huge, massive amounts of damage. And so King finally is released from that bondage, from that hold, and he wakes up where he was last absorbed, and he looks into the temple, and he sees that now True Ogre does not have the strength it takes to keep his body intact with Heihachi, and Heihachi tears the horn out of True Ogre, flips the horn upside down, and stabs it straight through the skull of True Ogre. And with that, the fight is done. Jin Kazuma is released. Heihachi picks up Kazuma and they go away. And King stands there. And as he looks into the sky, he knows that he finally did it. He was able to bring justice for the wrongs that was done to his father figure, to his mentor, and to the man who took care of all these kids, including him. And so he goes back to the real world and becomes one of the best pro wrestlers the world has ever seen, while training underneath Armored King. As time goes on, everything seems perfect. He's training and bonding with Armored King. He's becoming the world's greatest professional wrestler, professional wrestler champion, and he is taking care of all these orphans, and he is the head of the orphanage, taking care of all these kids, just like King the First once did, living in the footsteps of King the First. Unfortunately, that is where the happy ending ends, and King ends up entering a whole new life here in a moment. Armored King is enjoying a nice evening at a bar when Marduk, another professional wrestler, is giving him slack and just giving him a lot of crap and telling him that King is a piece of shit and that he is too a piece of shit, and luchadors have no place in the wrestling world. And this starts to anger Armored King, and Armored King ends up getting into a bar brawl with Marduk, and Marduk does not hold back, and Marduk pulls out all sorts of cheap, shitty, low blow attacks and grabs a whiskey bottle and bashes it over Armored King's head, and Armored King is somewhat intoxicated and is not capable of defending himself, and Marduk grabs the skull of Armored King and smashes it against a bar stool, snapping his neck, killing Armored King. Now, of course, King finds out about this, and Marduk is arrested and goes to prison for murder. And King has to again go through experiencing losing a father figure, his mentor, and the anger, the rage that he once had boils and resurfaces, and he is now again a man of vengeance. And Tekken 4 is on the way, and the 4th Iron Fist tournament is announced. Now he goes ahead and draws, and he is accepted. He also draws for Marduk, and Marduk too is accepted, and King pays and bribes the prison to release Marduk. And so Marduk is released and finds out that he has been invited to the 4th King of the Iron Fist tournament. Now, when we last left off with King, he had just learned that a man named Marduk had murdered Armored King. the second father figure that he has lost was murdered by this professional wrestler named Marduk in a bar brawl. Now, King has bribed the prison to release Marduk and took the precautions and made sure that he was accepted in the 4th Iron Fist tournament along with himself so that he can dish out punishment and vengeance with his own 2 hands. With that being said, let's hop in to this story. Now, before the King of the Iron Fist tournament starts, King decides to become much, much stronger using the help of his friends, which is a lesson he learned when he fought the Ogre. So he goes and gets back Makujin and Kuma and has them help him train while he helps them with other things. And he makes new friends with Julia and Lee, and the same goes for them. He helps them in certain ways, but he also gains certain types of training by helping them. And these people become somewhat of a family dynamic as they live on the same land and help each other out throughout these next 2 weeks to prepare for the 4th King of the Iron Fist tournament. King helps out Julia by rototilling the land and pulling weeds, farming, planting, but he has to do it barehanded and only use what God gave him, which is one of the oldest styles of martial arts training there is. And so they're helping each other out in that way. King is also helping Makujin learn more fighting styles, which is causing King to also be able to learn how to adapt to other fighting styles, while he also helps Kuma gather food so that Kuma can hibernate. And of course, he's only being able to use what God gave him, having to really hone into his animal instincts when it comes to hunting deer and gathering berries and so on and so forth. Now, Lee isn't really much of a help when it comes to physical training, since he's more of a businessman and a science man. However, him being a science man, he is able to test out certain high-tech training equipment on these people, including King, and King gets to be trained with the highest technology there is, the highest type of equipment that can keep track of his heart rate and his blood pressure and force him to his very limits, while Lee gets to learn what equipment works and what equipment will not work. So after the 2 weeks, after all this training, and after all the bonding that these people have done, it is finally time for the 4th King of the Iron Fist tournament, and so King heads off, saying goodbye to his new friends. But on the side, Marduk has not been slouching. He too has been training for this event because he knows what's up. Marduk's training is completely different from King's. It is not him bonding or making new friends. It is him going from street fight to street fight, from bar to bar, from underground layers to underground layers, bashing in the skulls of his victims because he got the roster. He knows that King is on there, and he has a feeling that King is the one paid to get him out of prison. And he knows that King is the one that wants him down, and that King wants revenge for what he did to Armored King. So Marduk is fighting incredible foes, unknown foes, and he is just annihilating these people, taking on the strongest fighters that he can find outside of the Iron Fist tournament to become as strong as he possibly can by time the fourth King of the Iron Fist tournament begins. And so he does this for 2 weeks, going from fight to fight to fight, up to 5 fights a day. And now the 4th King of the Iron Fist tournament begins, and King and Marduk show up, and they see the roster. They see Brian, they see Eddie, Hwang, Julia, Kazuha, King, Law, Lee, Lei, Nina, Paul, Exalu, Yoshimitsu, Christy, Marduk, and Steve Fox. And as they analyze and look at all of the opponents, the only ones they care about are themselves. Now, Marduk is up for the first match, and he is going up against Lee. Now, like we discussed earlier, Lee is not on the same level as the rest of these fighters. He's a businessman, he's a scientist, but he's taking this chance to finally be able to beat his father in a fight. Heihachi Mishima is Lee's target, and Lee wants to take over the Mishima organization for reasons we'll delve into when we get to Lee's storyline. Now, when this fight starts, this just boils more anger and rage in King, because Lee does not stand a chance, and Marduk plays really freaking dirty. As soon as Lee starts getting the upper hand by throwing massive amounts of kicks, just the fastest barrage of kicks you can imagine, and Marduk starts getting overwhelmed, he grabs the leg of Lee and starts just elbowing the kneecap of Lee until it starts to fracture. He then sweep kicks Lee onto the ground while still holding the leg and just drop elbows Lee's kneecap, shattering it. However, Lee gets back up because he's gone through huge character arc developments since Tekken 2. And he manages to dodge these massive attacks and punches thrown by Marduk because Lee is incredibly nimble and Marduk is just a huge freaking dude. And so with every kneecap thrown, with every punch thrown, you know that Lee is capable of dodging. However, Lee's attacks don't do any damage to Marduk. Marduk is just a pure muscular tank of a man. And so Marduk finally just has enough of it and grabs Lee by the neck, and this brings just tremendous flashbacks to King as he watches, and King is reimagining the necks of his two father figures being snapped, and he starts to panic. However, Lee manages to escape by breaking the thumb of Marduk and dropping back to the ground. However, Marduk does not hesitate with this broken thumb. He tackles Lee to the ground and just starts delivering punches and elbows to Lee's face until there's hardly anything to recognize on the facial features of Lee, and with that, Marduk takes the round. Now, the first match that King is up in, he goes up against Yoshimitsu. Now, Yoshimitsu is not a force to be reckoned with. However, he is not a one-on-one kind of fighter, nor is he tournament worthy when it comes to his style of fighting. So, though it may seem like he's going to be a chump, I will be able to redeem him in the future when I talk about Yoshimitsu's storyline. However, in this round, when Yoshimitsu swings the sword towards King manages to clap the blade in between his hands and then just snaps the blade and delivers a spear elbow directly to Yoshimitsu, knocking him out cold. Now again, if it sounds like I am belittling the worth of Yoshimitsu, he will be redeemed in the future. But now we are going to continue our focus on the battle between Marduk and King, because that is the fight that is up next. Now, as King and Marduk enter the ring for round 2, there is incredible hype because, unlike the other tournaments, there is a ring in the middle of a huge audience. They're in a stadium, and the audience knows what's up. They know that Marduk is the murderer of Armored King. They know what King the Second has been through, and so there is hype for this match. And when the round is begun, these two just start walking around each other, analyzing each other, and after a brief short amount of time, they finally engage in combat. So King dives in and throws as many punches and elbows, knees and kicks as he can towards Marduk. However, Marduk is blocking them and absorbing them with his pure amounts of muscle. And as Marduk is blocking and just absorbing these attacks, he is also slowly walking forward, pushing King back as King is being the offensive. King's on the offensive, but is still being pushed back to the corner of the ring. And so King starts attacking stronger and faster because every strike he throws, He is remembering the mentor of Armored King, and he's remembering all the memories and all the training that he had, and those memories turn into pain, and that pain then turns into anger, and that anger becomes strength, and every blow becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. But before you know it, King is in the corner of the ring, and Marduk uses both hands and grabs the neck of King and picks him up, squeezing it. King then starts to panic, and he feels his neck being bent backwards. Is this how every king is destined to go out? Is every king meant to die because of a snapped neck against an opponent that they cannot beat? No. If that is fate, then King II is not going to allow it to be his fate. He starts punching the face of Marduk while kicking Marduk in the groin, trying to get out of this grasp of this fierce, strength inhibited beast that he is going up against. He is not going to fail his revenge. He will not fail Armored King. And so he manages to just take his thumb and shove it in the eye of Marduk, and manages to push Marduk away, forcing the grasp of that neck hold to finally release. And as soon as King hits the ground, he charges with massive force. King connects a punch to Marduk, while Marduk connects a punch to King, and King returns, connecting another strike, while Marduk returns a connecting strike. Following that, this continues over and over and over. King uppercuts Marduk in the ribcage, causing Marduk to spit out blood, and Marduk grabs a hold of King's hand and snaps whatever fingers Marduk can get a hold of. King does scream in pain, but he still recoils and knocks Marduk in the middle of the face, right between the eyes with an elbow, and then delivers a sweeping kick to Marduk. Marduk hits the ground and gets back up, but as he's getting up, King delivers a sweeping kick right to the ribs of Marduk, knocking him down again. Marduk goes to get back up, and King punches downwards, striking the skull of Marduk, slamming him down again. Marduk tries to get up one more time, but King jumps on top of him and gets him in a neck hold, pulling his neck back, delivering open palm strikes to the back of Marduk's skull as he squeezes his biceps around Marduk's neck, trying to get this guy out. There is no way he can kill Marduk live in front of the audience. He is an icon. Many, many orphans are watching King. He is a hero to children, so he knows what he's about to do must be done in private. He must hospitalize Marduk and then finish him off in private. So he releases the neck hold and picks Marduk up, throwing him into the corner of the ring. And as he charges in, Marduk tries to defend himself, but is incapable. King is throwing too fast and too strong of punches, just drilling into the torso of Marduk. Marduk starts to become dizzy. He starts to become weak in the legs, but every time he starts to fall, King picks him back up, throws him back into the corner of the ring, and continues the onslaught that Marduk is just not handling. And King cannot tire. King cannot get out of this rage, this lust for vengeance. He will not stop striking Marduk. And over and over and over, he stops Marduk from collapsing and throws him back into the ring, and just keeps delivering these blows that are shaking the very ring they stand in. However, enough is enough, and finally King stops the onslaught and lets Marduk fall to the ground, collapsing in the ring. The audience is silent as King walks away the victor, Marduk is carried away by an ambulance, having to wear an oxygen mask just to breathe, as an EMT rides on top of him, trying to get him to stay alive long enough to get to the hospital. King does not show up for the third round. That would have been against Kazuha. He goes missing. Now, later, hours and hours later, he is seen walking into the hospital with a bouquet of flowers. He walks into Marduk's room. He is hospitalized. He is unconscious. He had received the beating of a lifetime. And King sets the roses down onto Marduk's chest, grabs hold of Marduk's neck, raises his hand to deliver the final blow. And before he brings his fist down, he sees a picture next to Marduk. And this picture is of Marduk with his wife and his son. King looks at it and realizes what he's about to do. He's about to take away someone's father. He's about to take away someone's husband. And he is about to cause the very pain that Marduk has caused him. And that is when King decides that this trend must stop. No one deserves to lose anybody, regardless of what the person may have done. And with that, King leaves the hospital and goes home to his orphanage and continues to take care of the orphans for the following years to come. And now we get to move on to the 5th Tekken and the 5th Iron Fist tournament. Throughout the years of Tekken 4 and Tekken 5, in between that time, King continues his relationship with Julia, Lee, Makujin, and Kuma, while also running the orphanage and becoming one of the most incredible icons in professional wrestling that all young men could look up to, because ever since the events with Marduk, King has made a vow to always take the high road and to always do what's right. Now, throughout the years between Tekken 4 and Tekken 5, life really does seem perfect, and it is. King has a very good life as a professional luchador, professional wrestler. And so, with that said, meanwhile, Marduk has been training very hard so that he could get back at King. And the 5th Iron Fist tournament has been announced, and Marduk looks at the roster as he's wanting to join, but there is no King. King has decided not to join this tournament. So, Marduk, enraged that he will never have that rematch, goes on the television during a professional wrestling match, donning the black Armored King Jaguar mask. As King sees this on the television, anger boils within him. Marduk then uses the time he has to just insult and slander Armor King, and throwing shade at a dead man that cannot defend himself. This enrages King, and Marduk, live on the television, tells King exactly where to go for a rematch, and telling him that he would never stand a chance in a real fight between them. And so King dons his Jaguar mask once again and walks out of the orphanage, leaving Lee in charge. And as he's walking, he is confronted by Julia. Julia begins to beg him not to do this, that he has already gotten his vengeance, and not to let Marduk's words get to him. King, however, tells her to step aside, and he does not want to hurt a friend, but he must put an end to this. Julia refuses, and King has no choice but to fight a close friend. King grabs Julia and throws her to the side. However, Julia manages to swing around him, getting on top of his shoulders, trying to squeeze the neck of King. King manages to pick her up and throw her off of him, and then the fight continues and begins. He starts throwing punches at Julia, but Julia managing to gracefully dodge and move around every single one of them, knowing she cannot get hit by King. She manages to throw powerful kicks that knock King back, but King will not be deterred from what he has to do. And so, King and Julia engage in close to toe-to-toe combat, as every punch he throws does not land. She manages to just avoid every single strike. He then goes to grappling. However, she is able to use incredible techniques to twist his wrists in order to relieve the pressure from any grapples that he may attempt to get a hold of her. She then starts dancing around King, kicking him and punching him and elbowing him, causing damage. She's landing karate chops to the back of his neck, causing him to go down continuously. So King decides to use the same style of techniques, dancing around Julia as she dances around him. They are both now dodging and avoiding, bobbing and weaving each other's attacks. And King does not want to hurt his close friend. He does not want to hurt Julia. Julia, on the other end, does not want to hurt King. And King knows this. So he throws dirt in the air and creating a blind spot from Julia. He just manages to travel alongside the dirt cloud and brings his arms around Julia, getting her in a neck hold, ever so gently squeezing. She's throwing massive punches behind her shoulder and over her shoulder into the face of King, trying to get him to let go, but he will not. And so Julia decides to pick her legs up and swings her legs forward, and when her legs touch the ground, she bends her back forward and manages to flip King over her shoulders, slamming him into the ground. With that, King quickly manages to pick himself up with one hand, swinging himself in a circle, delivering a massive airborne roundhouse directly to Julia, sending her flying across the ground. As she slowly starts to pick her up, he looks at her and apologizes as he delivers an elbow directly to the forehead of Julia, knocking her out cold. He looks at her, sorry for what he had to do, and goes to face Marduk. King finally makes it to the destination given to him by Marduk, with Marduk waiting there for him in his fighting attire, accompanied by his fans and biker gang to watch Marduk finally take on and defeat his rival. King looks at Marduk in anger. Marduk then points to King. "I have changed my ways," he says, continuing his pointing finger. "I will defeat you fair and square. No tricks. None of that. I am here today to prove that I am the better fighter." These words settle in King, as King realizes that this is not a vengeance fight, nor is it a battle to the death. This is a fight simply to see who is the better fighter. And with that, the fight begins. King and Marduk clash as they both attempt a tackle, as they're pushing against each other, trying to force the other one down. And so now they start just swinging each other around, and they will ungrapple with one hand in order to punch the other opponent. King lets go with one hand and starts delivering elbows and punches to the gut of Marduk, while Marduk will let go of one of his grapples and start delivering equal amounts of blows to the guts of King. As they're delivering blows to the torso, they finally force each other to let go. So Marduk then delivers a massive chamber kick to King that sends King flying against a wooden rod, and the wooden rod snaps. King catches the rod before it falls on him, and throws it like a spear directly towards Marduk. Marduk catches it with one hand, slamming it to the ground, and looks at him. "You don't seem to get it. This is a professional match. No dirty tricks," as he points to King. King nods in understanding of what this is and continues the battle. He starts throwing jabs and punches, kicks and thrusting elbows as Marduk receives some with damage and blocks and dodges others, while Marduk also throws massive punches, landing some and missing others. King and Marduk are not dodging and weaving. They're not bobbing and weaving. They're not rope-a-doping. They are absorbing these punches in hopes that they can return a bigger one, and this becomes a massive game of hit for hit, with every hit connecting, causing shockwaves throughout the area. Marduk then places both hands on the shoulders of King and starts delivering massive headbutts directly into King's face. As King slowly starts getting forced to his knees, he grabs the testicles of Marduk and twists them, forcing Marduk to let go. King then stands up and delivers a massive rounding elbow to the jawline of Marduk, rocking Marduk back. King then jumps in the air and extends both his legs, landing a double airborne kick into the chest of Marduk. Marduk goes falling down. King then charges Marduk again. As Marduk gets up, King dives in the air, sending a flying spear knee directly to the gut of Marduk, causing Marduk to puke up blood. As Marduk is about to fall to the ground, King knees him in the face, causing Marduk to actually stand back up by pure force. And then King starts dancing around Marduk, throwing blows. Marduk is hurt at this point, and every time Marduk tries to throw a punch, they are slow and weak. King is able to avoid it easily and counters with an over-shoulder rounding punch that is going downwards, causing Marduk to have his back bent every time he is punched in the face. Marduk then proceeds to attempt a bear hug on King and is successful and picks King up off the ground, squeezing him as hard as he can in hopes to force King into submission. However, King manages to wiggle one of his arms out and delivers a straight down elbow into the skull of Marduk, forcing Marduk to let go. King then starts throwing massive punches straight into the air pipe of Marduk. And Marduk ends up getting to a point where he just can't breathe. And as he starts trying to get away and stepping backwards, King just keeps on the onslaught and keeps going forward, throwing these massive punches. And so Marduk reaches down and grabs the leg of King, and then grabs the other leg of King and puts them in between his armpits and just starts twirling King around and around and around and around and around, and then jumps into the air and turns himself sideways so that King is being spun towards the ground, and then he just lets go, sending King flying headfirst into concrete with enough force that it actually creates a small crater. However, King manages to pull his head out of the concrete as Marduk is falling to the ground and just delivers a massive uppercut connecting to Marduk's jaw before Marduk actually lands to the ground. And this punch has so much force, it sends Marduk flipping backwards in the air 3, 4, maybe even 5 times, and then he hits the ground and Marduk is out. As he taps out on the ground 3 times, Marduk has submitted. King, realizing that Marduk has become a completely different person than in the past and has truly worked on himself in between Tekken 4 and 5, sends down a hand to help Marduk up, and Marduk gets up, grabbing the hand of King, and as they grasp each other's hands, they look each other into the eyes with newfound respect. And these two create a bond, as Marduk explains that he regrets ever killing somebody, and that he was drunk and did not know what he was doing, and he took the prison time because he knew he earned it. He knew he deserved it. And so, with this new respect, these two become incredible partners in the professional wrestling world. And they join tag team matches, and they are an unstoppable force. No opponent can handle the pure force and teamwork of Marduk and King. And throughout the years between Tekken 5 and Tekken 6, these two become brothers. Now, in the beginning of Tekken 6, Marduk is assaulted and sent to the hospital. When King finds this out, he watches the news footage and sees Armored King being the one to assault Marduk. At least it's someone pretending to be Armored King. And so King goes to the gravestone and starts to dig up the grave of Armored King to make sure it's not actually him. Marduk, meanwhile, wakes up in the hospital, realizing that Armored King was the one who assaulted him. He too goes to the gravestone and sees King. And as they dig up the gravesite, Marduk is saying, I know I killed him. I know that I killed Armored King. And King agrees. And as they finally dig up the coffin, they open it up, and sure enough, the corpse of Armored King is in the coffin. And then they hear footsteps, and as they turn around, there stands Armored King, or someone in the Armored King attire. Marduk and King ask him who he is and why he dons the Armored King attire. However, this person does not respond with words, but instead lunges at them with the intent to harm Marduk and King. Armored King charges in and jumps into the air, extending his right leg, kicking Marduk in the face, while simultaneously extending his left leg, kicking King into the chest, knocking them both back. Armored King then dives towards Marduk, throwing massive uppercuts into the rib cages of Marduk. Marduk starts rope-a-doping them and blocking them with his biceps, but every time a strike is blocked in the torso, Armored King then delivers a massive hook to the jawline of Marduk, rocking him backwards, rocking him side to side, and just shaking the giant beast that Marduk is. Armored King is also delivering massive roundhouse kicks to the kneecaps of Marduk, trying to knock down this giant. And anytime Armored King just takes his eyes off of King for a second, King will come in and they try to double up on this imposter. However, Armored King manages to swipe King away using wrist grapples, tossing him to the side, continuing his onslaught on Marduk. His main target is Marduk. Now, as Armored King is giving Marduk this massive onslaught and using the spikes that he has on his armor to slash the skin of Marduk and jab them into the biceps and the legs of Marduk, he is obviously trying to kill King's new best friend. And so King manages to sneak up behind Armored King and grapple him around the waistline and just throws him over backwards and slamming Armored King down to the ground. However, Armored King is incredibly durable and gets right back up and delivers a massive roundhouse to King, throwing him across the graveyard. Armored King then tackles Marduk, but does not tackle him to the ground. He tackles him with his shoulder and just charges outside of the gravestone, or out of the graveyard, with Marduk. As Marduk is elbowing the back of Armored King, trying to get him to let go, they eventually leave the graveyard and go right into a busy highway, and Marduk gets slammed right into the trailer of a semi-truck, and they are now standing in the middle of the freeway, exchanging blows and dancing around each other as Marduk is trying to take down this Armored King, and Armored King is trying to kill Marduk. Armored King then pulls a stop sign out of the ground and swings it like a baseball bat, sending Marduk flying down the highway, and then Marduk then gets nicked by a moving car. Now, most of these cars are trying to weave out of the way, not to run over these two massive titans that are engaged in combat in the middle of traffic. Armored King and Marduk engage in battle, walking through and fighting their way down the highway into the city center. And Armored King is just beating the crap out of Marduk and manages to get a hold of Marduk's skull, smashing it against the corner of a brick store. And as he repeatedly smashes the skull of Marduk into the store, Marduk is trying to reach up and grab the face of Armored King and grab anything he can to try to get Armored King to let go. But Armored King just keeps batting away the hand and continuously smashes Marduk's skull against the building, and then throws Marduk down onto the ground where his neck is hanging off of the sidewalk, and he is about to stomp on the face of Marduk, snapping his neck, at least attempting to snap his neck. And just in time, King manages to finally make it to where they were and tackles Armored King. Now, Marduk is out for the count. He has flesh wounds everywhere from the spikes of Armored King. He was nicked by a car. He was smashed into the trailer of a truck in the middle of a fast-moving, paced traffic. And so this guy's injured. He's down for a while. And now it is just King and Armored King as they exchange blows. Finally, Armored King has enough, and it seems like he just easily catches King's punch and then delivers a massive uppercut to King, knocking him back. Armored King then is about to have a conversation with King. Armored King asks why. Why is King friends with the man that killed his mentor, the man that killed his father figure? And King just looks at Armored King and he explains the true reason. Because in the events of Tekken 3, King got to feel and actually see his vengeance, his rage, and his anger. He got to see it, and it terrified him that something that awful could exist inside of him. And it came back when he lost Armored King, realizing that he was about to do something that was truly awful and that he could never forgive himself for. So he has made a vow. King has made a vow to himself to never go down that path again. And with that being said, King continues to explain that King the First would have never gone down the road of vengeance, for he was a pure, kind-hearted man that only did what was right. And Armored King too would not go down the road of vengeance, and that this was not the way. Forgiveness was the best way to make the world a better place. Armored King does not want to hear any of this, and it enrages him even more. And so he goes in for the kill on King. Armored King charges at King, walking just slightly past him as he charges, extending his left hand and grabbing the face of King, and then thrusting him forward into the window of a store, smashing his face through glass. And as King is bent over backwards through this window, then Armored King just starts delivering these massive blows into the gut of King. With him being bent over like this, it is going to cause much, much more damage. King cannot use his muscles to protect the organs he has inside of his body, right? And so this damages King, and King quickly bends back over through the glass, not knowing that a massive uppercut is waiting for him to send him back flying into the window of the store. And King goes back flipping into the store as Armored King jumps through and starts grabbing whatever he can to just try to annihilate King. He's reaching over and just grabbing glass jars off the shelves, slamming them into the skull and the face of King. He is just knocking over shelves on top of King while delivering sweep kicks to King, making sure that King is not standing up straight to catch these shelves. Finally, King just tackles Armored King and lunges him through the wall of the store back outside and throws him across. And now King realizes the pure force and the pure anger that Armored King has. This guy is not going to let King walk away alive. And so King gets into a defensive stance, learning everything that he's learned from Julia, Lee, Kuma, and Makujin. King has what it takes to survive, and he, thanks to the training with Makujin, knows how to adapt to different fighting styles. And so he puts a little bit of a dance to his step, but more of a defensive, stern barrier with his arms. King then incorporates Julia's fighting style when it comes to the graceful dodging of Armored King's attacks, as he steps gracefully and using his hand to just gently push the strikes away, while simultaneously using Kuma's pure strength with a counter strike, and then using Makujin's fighting style and fighting adaptability in order to predict what Armored King is going to do next. And of course, Lee's training showing him that he can be pushed to the very limit and that he could survive being pushed to the edge. And so that's exactly what he intends to do, is push himself to the edge to bring down Armored King. Armored King is not letting up, however. He sees all of this. He sees King as a great opponent. So he pulls out a very large hunting blade out of the back pocket that he had right underneath his armor and swings it at King. The blade connects to King, and King drops with the blade shoved into his gut, looking at Armored King, astonished at the pure level of desperation that Armored King is at, for he was never at this level. Even with Ogre, he wanted to do it with his bare hands, with his pure strength. And Armored King, what makes this worse of a defeat is Armored King did not need a blade to bring down King. He did it because it was convenient and easy. Armored King far outmatched King when it came to pure strength, ability, combat, and what have you. Marduk finally catches up to these two as he sees his best friend on the ground and on his knees with a massive blade in his gut. And so Marduk, in rage, charges towards Armored King, and King tries to say stop. King tries to tell Marduk not to do it, but he cannot speak, for the blade is just causing too much pain. And so as Marduk charges Armored King, Armored lunges in and picks up Marduk, smashing him into the ground, gets on top of Marduk, and just starts delivering unstoppable blows directly into the face of Marduk. King tries to stand up and tries to get to Armored King before he kills his best friend, before he does something that he is going to regret. King needs to save 2 lives at this point, but he just cannot walk long enough to get to where Marduk and Armored King are. And he starts to panic and begins to pull himself with his arms, crawling to Armored King and Marduk. King finally gets to Marduk and Armored King and picks himself up and pushes King off of Marduk and forces Armored King to the ground as he stares into the eyes of Armored King. And though Armored King is wearing the Black Jaguar mask, he can see tears running down the neck right underneath the mask of Armored King, and he builds up the strength so that he can finally talk. And he tells Armored King that this is not the way, and that if he does this, there is no coming back. Armored King is not listening as he's struggling to get King off of him, and finally he does get King off of him. And as he goes back to finish off Marduk, the police finally show up and arrest all three of them. After being put in jail for a little while, King manages to negotiate with the police and pays for all the damages and gets Marduk released along with himself. He also pleads with the police that Armored King is in a bad spot and needs therapy. And so they work out an agreement to help out Armored King. And so Armored King is still wanting to know who this man is, and he wants to know. And as the years pass, he begins to look for Armored King, because after Armored King leaves therapy and leaves prison, there is no sign of him. And so King searches for this man in hopes that he can save him from this path. And that is when he receives an invitation from Marduk for the 6th Iron Fist tournament. And they both hope that Armored King will be there so that they can finish this once and for all. As King and Marduk enter the 6th Iron Fist tournament, they see Armored King along with all the other competitors: Asuka, Bayek, Bruce, Christy, Ganru, Hurwong, Law, Lily, Paul, Steve, Bob, and of course themselves. And in the first round, of course, this strikes fear into King, because the first round is Marduk and Armored King, and he knows what's driving Armored King. He knows that Armored King, for one reason or another, regardless of who this man is, has been wanting revenge on Marduk, just like he wanted revenge on Marduk so many years ago. And so with the first round on the way, it plays out completely differently than how you would expect. Armored King has gone through incredible transformations, however not emotional, purely physical. And as Marduk throws a massive punch to Armored King, he catches it with one hand with ease, and then spins around, delivering a spinning reverse hook kick right into the jaw of Marduk, knocking out the Titan of Marduk. We all know what Marduk's capable of. We all know how strong Marduk is. We know that Marduk can take a hell of a beating, and he is knocked out with one blow from Armored King. And now King is up for a round, and he has to win. He has to face Armored King once again, and he has to find out what Armored King is about. King's first opponent is Ganru. Now remember, in Tekken 6, Paul and Law rigged the tournament so that they can win. And so what they did was they got a hold of the roster and made sure they set up the roster in a way to where all the strongest fighters were facing each other, so that they were exhausted, winded, and tired by the ending of the round. And then they also had Steve, who was going to throw the match once he made it to the semifinals. And so that is why we have Marduk versus Armored King right off the bat, why we have King against Ganru right off the bat. And so Ganru is just absorbing all the strikes that King is throwing out. He is an incredible sumo wrestler, and that's kind of what he does, right? He absorbs attacks, and he delivers massive open palm strikes. However, King, using what he learned from Akujin and Julia, is able to avoid these strikes, and he starts doing much more fluid attacks that are at a faster pace with not as much strength or power behind them, just to wind Ganru. And he spins around Ganru, he dances around Ganru, throwing attacks to the legs. Since Ganru's a sumo wrestler, not having the proper strength in his legs could be very devastating for him as the fight goes on, and King is aware of this. So King definitely does everything he can to tire out Ganryu. And after about 8 minutes of Ganryu taking punishment and being danced around and not being able to land a strike on King, Ganryu finally starts to tire, and King delivers a massive right hook into Ganryu, followed by a massive left hook into Ganryu, and then followed again by a right hook, followed again by a left hook, and this continues over and over and over and over until Ganryu is laying face first on the mat, and the match is won, going to King. King gets to match up against Armored King once again in the second round, and now King knows the strength of Armored King, but he also knows the pain and sorrow of Armored King. He understands what Armored King is going through, though he doesn't know what the original Armored King was. When it comes to this Armored King, he doesn't know what the relationship was, but he does understand what Armored King's going through, why he chose the path of vengeance. And so he goes in and commences battle with Armored King. However, this, like I said before, is a completely different version of Armored King than what they fought just a few months or a year ago, right? This Armored King has gone through huge changes, and now King just cannot land a punch. Armored King is dancing around them like they're nothing, dodging them like they're nothing, and mocking King as he goes to throw a punch that would connect and stopping short. This enrages King. He's making a fool out of King. And this type of revenge is completely different than just wanting to kill them. He is out to humiliate Marduk and King, and that's exactly what he is doing. And so King tries to get into a grapple with Armored King, and Armored King manages to wiggle his way around King, reversing the grapple, locking King's legs in place, locking King's arms behind his back, and locking his neck into a chokehold simultaneously, and then falls backwards, bringing King down, with King on top of Armored King. However, it's in a grapple, so King is not at the advantage, and he manages to force King to pass out, taking the round seemingly easily, right? And so Armored King moves on to the third round. King and Marduk, as they're leaving, they're realizing the pure force of Armored King, and that this new rival is going to be a problem for quite some time. Now, Armored King moves on to the semifinals and is facing against Law. However, Paul manages to sneak laxatives into a meal that Armored King was having just before the match, and so Armored King ends up not being able to compete in that round. And then Steve goes up against Paul, and Steve throws the match, leaving it up to Paul and Law. And of course, they rigged it so that they could both win, and so the tournament goes to them. Now, of course, throughout the events of Tekken 6 and Tekken 7, they are in the middle of World War III. And throughout World War III, people are trying to find entertainment, which is where professional wrestling comes in. Because though there are not any Iron Fist tournaments throughout the actual duration of World War III, they are still living their daily lives, right? And so King is in the professional wrestling world along with Marduk, and now along with Armored King. And so throughout the years, Armored King and King are just growing immensely in strength, constantly trying to one-up each other, while Marduk is on the side trying to keep up with the both of them. And so King will take some fights, and Armored King will take other fights, and they become one of the most iconic rivals the world has ever seen. And there's always incredible hype when these two are on screen. When we last left off, there were huge moments and huge conflicts between King and Armored King. However, since then, they have been iconic rivals and have become somewhat bonded to each other as rivals. They're somewhat frenemies now, right? And so they are just consistently fighting in the ring and doing professional wrestling matches against each other, with Marduk also going up against King on some days and going up against Armored King on other days. And because of my last video causing me to stutter and hesitate consistently due to saying King and Armored King repeatedly back and forth and interchangeably, it got very confusing. So I will be referring to Armored King as AK for now on, just so that I can deliver a better storytelling experience. So AK will win other fights, and King will win some fights. Marduk will win some and lose some as well. And so these three become incredibly iconic rivals, but they're also training like crazy. Marduk is doing his normal style of training, which is fighting anyone he can get his hands on and anyone who's accepting the challenge, and he purposefully goes up against people that he feels are stronger than himself. Armored King is just going into the middle of nowhere and doing survival training to improve his strength and then honing his skills in the ring. While King is honing his skills in the ring as well, he is also continuing his training with Lee, Julia, Kuma, and Makujin, and these guys have reached a whole new level of strength when they enter Tekken 7. And now that we are finally in Tekken 7 with King's storyline, that is where he finally breaks off from AK and Marduk and kind of goes on his own. Now, AK and Marduk are in the 7th Iron Fist tournament, but they are not a part of King's story because Marduk and Armored King become their own entity when it comes to storyline. And when I cover their story, it's just going to be covering the Tekken 7 events. Now, back to King. King finally gets accepted into the Tekken 7 tournament, the Iron Fist tournament, and he goes, and of course, he sees all these people, these extremely good fighters, some he's never met before, and now his first round is going to be going up against Bob. Now, Bob would appear to be incredibly overweight, incredibly unfit. However, he moves as fast as Xiaoyu and Huang with the nimbleness of Lee and Yoshimitsu and Kunamitsu, right? And so he just has this vicious combination of incredible speed, incredible nimbleness, with incredible power behind every strike he throws, and just incredible strength behind every strike. And so as he's fighting King, he is just flipping through the air, delivering incredibly fast-paced but yet massively strong strikes behind them, and King is rope-a-doping them away. He's blocking the majority of them, and while he's fighting Bob, he's using his legs not to attack, but to kick the legs of Bob to correct Bob's footwork. He is actually improving the fighting style of Bob. And basically what we're seeing here is a huge character arc development in King. Because as King is fighting Bob, he is not doing offensive attacks to harm Bob. He's doing offensive attacks that are moving and forcing the body of Bob to move into a better form to improve Bob's fighting style. This is a whole new form of training that King is implementing on to Bob. And this is training that he had received from Armored King, the Armored King that trained him when he was a young lad. And so with that being said, Bob's fighting style and Bob's strength and speed improves even more than what it originally was. And now the fight gets to become serious. So in a short amount of time, King has turned an already good opponent into an amazing opponent that is becoming increasingly equal with King due to King consistently forcing Bob into a better stance, improving his opponent's fighting style. And as Bob is fighting King, King is now at a point where he does not have to correct the stance or fighting style of Bob, because Bob doesn't realize what's going on. All Bob thinks that he's getting better on his own in the fight, learning from King. And so King now gets to start dancing with his footwork, moving his legs, and starts dancing around Bob. Even though he's much, much slower than Bob, Bob is missing every drop kick, every spinning kick, every airborne punch, everything. And so King is noticing that Bob is using the air and gravity far too much for his fighting style, and they are not accurate with a moving opponent. And so King starts forcing Bob down to the ground and planting Bob's feet onto the ground, forcing him to actually fight onto the ground, utilizing his nobility while being stern into the ground like a tree, forcing Bob again to increase his effectiveness as an opponent. And so Bob starts using his elbows, spear elbows, similar to what King is using, and now King is having to revert to King the First's abilities and King the First's fighting style of going from strikes to grapples, from grapples to strikes, combining his martial arts with his pro wrestling abilities. Once King has decided that Bob has gotten as good as he's gonna get in the fight, King feels like this opponent is not the level of opponent that he is needing, and decides to sweep kick Bob onto the ground and then delivers a straight down punch into the skull of Bob, knocking him out for the round, giving the win to King. Now, King gets to move on to the second round, which is against Steve, and I love this so much. This is not in the game, nor is it in the animes, because the animes ceased to exist after Tekken 2 events. However, the comic books really do kick into this, and I will actually be referring to a fan-made comic because of how awesome this is, and it correlates with the fight with Bob just so well, and it transfers it over to Steve. So as the round begins, Steve gets in a boxing stance, and King puts a finger up, signifying 1 moment, give me a second, and walks over and stands side by side with Steve, facing the same direction, and puts his feet very similar to Steve, and then puts his arms up very similar to Steve, and looks over like this. And Steve looks at him very confused with a smirk on his face. No, you wanna move your arms just a little bit more. Bring your right arm back a tad. And so King is now like trying to figure out Steve's boxing stance. And so Steve is now like coaching King on how to fight like a boxer. And once this is said and done, King goes back to his side of the ring and gets into that boxing stance, and King throws everything that he already knew away and takes on Steve like a boxer. And now we have this perfect fan service boxing match between King and Steve Fox. And Steve Fox and King are rope-a-doping, jabbing, right-hooking, left-hooking, uppercutting, and boxing each other. And even though Steve knows way more of what he's doing when it comes to boxing, King is standing his ground and giving Steve a really good fight. And King is holding his own very well. And even though Steve Fox is a much faster-paced moving fighter than King, King's blows are incredibly outmatching the strength of Steve Fox. And so, as the fight goes on, and as they're going back and forth and dancing around each other, rope-a-doping, bobbing and weaving, dodging each other's attacks, King is having just a fun time, and Steve is having a fun time as well, because this is not the same King. And as they are fighting each other, I am going to explain the character arc development that we are seeing in King. You see, when King first debuted as King the First, he was a tragic, broken man, And when we got King the Second that debuted in Tekken 3, the King that we are covering today, he was too a broken young man who had his sights on vengeance and vengeance only. And that continued into Tekken 4, but instead of going up against a higher entity, he was going up against just another man who made a mistake. And when he was about to kill that man, he realized the path he was going down. And even after he changed his ways, the second fight with Marduk, was still a very gruesome fight on King's end. King was actually pulling out more trick shots than Marduk was. I mean, he reached up and twisted the testicles of Marduk. But now we have gotten a more of a mentor version of King, because he's much, much older now. And he is just a mentor, and he's a sportsman. He's been spending the majority of his life in the ring as a professional wrestler, and it's become more of a game for him. So he is just enjoying life at this point. He is finally content with where he's at. And so he's having fun improving other fighters to create this rivalry bond, friendship style group of people. And that is what we're seeing with King versus Bob. And that's also what we're seeing now with King versus Steve, with him boxing Steve. And they're just having a good time, and it's fun to see. So as they are boxing each other, King finally starts getting outmatched by Steve and manages to break away from Steve and gets into his professional wrestling style. And then again, just goes full on grappling combined with striking maneuvers and attacks, and finally brings down Steve and knocks him out, winning the round. In the third round, King goes up against Hero Wang. Now, Hero Wang, if I'm saying it correctly, I never could figure out how to pronounce that damn name, but he's such a cool character. In the fight between King and Hero Wang, it plays out very, very similar to the fight with Steve and Bob. Hero Wang is throwing awesome, amazing fast pace and strength inhibited kicks directly to King. And these kicks have just a huge variety of locations that Hero Wang can strike. He is a master in Taekwondo, and he is a master at Judo, and he is just very, very good at what he does. King is bobbing and weaving and rope-a-doping these attacks, and he's even incorporating some of the boxing styles that he just learned from Steve to take on Hero Wang. Now, Hero Wang is able to block strikes using his legs instead of using his arms. He doesn't really rope-a-dope much in the game, at least not if you know how to play as him. You can use his legs to bat away attacks, taking away any chance of your block being broken, which makes Hero Wang an incredibly an amazing character for defensive fighting if you're a defensive style player. Now, going back to the story, King decides that he's actually looking at Hero Wang, and he's noticing some flaws in Hero Wang's fighting style, and Hero Wang sends a massive sidekick that King manages to sidestep, and it misses him, but he catches the leg of Hero Wang. Now, Hero Wang thinks that King is about to go in for an attack, but instead, King straightens the leg of Hero Wang and straightens it out and makes it a better kick, and then just ever so gently sweeps the other leg of Hero Wang, creating a better stance. And then he pats Hero Wang on the shoulder like, okay, that's how you kick. That's what I want you to do next time. And so Hero Wang does do that in that exact same form that King just put him in, and it delivers a massive kick that sends King flying into the corner of the ring. And King just starts laughing, and he goes in. And now Hero Wang is throwing much better kicks. However, King is still rope-a-doping and avoiding all of these kicks, and Hero Wang goes in for a grapple. However, when it comes to the professional wrestling legend of King, there is just no way that Hwang can grapple this guy. When it comes to that game, you've entered his house. You walk through the front door of his home. And so King is just getting out of these grapples easily and then putting him in the exact same grapple that Hwang tried to do, but much, much better. And as soon as Hwang is about to either tap out or pass out, King lets go and allows Hwang to attempt another grapple. Now, this goes on for quite some time, and then King just picks up Hwang and gives him a wink and throws him out of the ring hard enough to when he hits the ground, he is out for the count. Now, the last fight is not a fun fight, because the last fight is King versus Jack 7, and King remembers the stories of when King the First went up against Jack 2, or just Jack. I think it was just Jack at that point. So he remembers being an orphan, sitting down and listening to the epic battle that King the First had to engage in when he fought Jack, and King is somewhat nostalgic, intimidated, but also just incredibly excited that he gets to relive this chapter in his old mentor's life. And so the final match between King the Second and Jack 7 begin, and Jack throws a massive punch that just shakes the ground, throwing King back, and King looks at Jack, astonished and amazed, and the memories of all the stories that King the First comes back, and this just makes him so happy that he starts to tear up. And because this is an incredible event, he gets to relive the stories of his father figure, of his predecessor. And so he dives in, and he wants this fight to happen, and so he dives back towards Jack, even though Jack just demonstrated amazing strength, and with every punch that Jack 7 throws at King, King blocks it, and the ground shakes, the ring just vibrates, and his muscles are just not handling this massive amounts of punishment that Jack 7 is delivering to King. And when King has the chance, he does try to dodge it, though Jack 7 is highly evolved compared to the original Jack. He has such amazing combat-orientated software that he is able to predict a lot of King's dodging movements, so King is forced to just block and just absorb these massive blows, and he can feel his bones. King can feel his bones starting to fracture due to the pure strength and power from Jack 7. However, whenever King throws a punch, it does put dents into the torso of Jack, and he starts managing to just overwhelm Jack 7 by just pure willpower, forcing himself to go into the offensive, throwing strikes and punches and kicks to Jack 7. And even though it hurts like hell when he blocks a punch at this point, he uses his biceps to push the punch away and just counter-strike with a right hook, or a spearing elbow, or a spearing knee, or a roundhouse kick, a side kick, a flying kick, you name it. King is taking on this monstrous beast, Jack 7. And this is the last fight for King in the Tekken franchise, up until they at least release the final game, the final installment, Tekken 8. And I hope they don't ruin this character, because this fight is one of the funnest fights to watch. And with that being said, I'm only going to do this a handful of times because I really do enjoy the narration, but I feel like because of how much time we spent with King and how long I've talked about him, I want to show the actual fight, not the gameplay, but I want to show the choreography and the actual cinematic experience of this final fight that we have of King taking on Jack 7. So without further ado, here it is. And that is the final fight that we see King having in the Tekken franchise thus so far. And hopefully you guys did not mind me doing that. I just have built somewhat of a connection with this character doing this 5-part series, and I'm building a connection with all these characters, writing all these scripts and rereading about them and re-experiencing everything that I loved about these characters. And so I wanted to give him a good send-off, showing his first fight. Now, with that being said, that is the end of King's story. So, thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed, please do consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and maybe even sharing. It helps me out a lot. I'm a very small channel. Do not get hit by a meteor. Take care of yourselves, and bye.